A similar cubistic merging of profile and frontal views is used, suggesting the restless shifting of the figure. The robust flesh tones of the first portrait have drained away here, leaving a pallid figure punctuated by an impulsively hurled line of white pigment and framed by a faint linear cube. Dyer's face is similarly isolated by a rectangle illusionistically affixed to the wall by a long nail. Portrait of Isabel Rawsthorne of 1966. Later, Bacon scrutinized the face of Dyer, this time along with that of their friend Isabel Rawsthorne. Scraped, blotted, and dragged strokes of transparent and opaque paint coalesce to conjure with startling veracity the appearances of Dyer and Rawsthorne. 3 Studies of Isabel Rawsthorne of 1967. Bacon had focused on Isabel Rawsthorne in a number of previous paintings, including this one. The figure reaches toward an abnormally high lock, key in hand, glancing over her shoulder as though to spot pursuers. In the darkness beyond the door, she appears a second time, wearing gold earrings and perhaps a black dress in this lightless place. Pinned to the wall at the left is a third image of Rawsthorne, its vertical striations mimicking the veiling of Bacon's figures during the 1950s, and lining up with the stripes of the screen to which it is attached. Study for the Portrait of Isabel Rawsthorne of 1964. 3 Studies of Isabel Rawsthorne on a white background of 1965. Three Studies of Isabel Rawsthorne on a clear background of 1965. Three Studies of Isabel Rawsthorne of 1966. Study of Isabel Rawsthorne, 1966. Portrait of George Dyer speaking, 1966. Lying Figure of 1966. Three Studies of Muriel Belcher of 1966. Three Studies of George Dyer of 1966. Study for the Head of George Dyer of 1967. Portrait of George Dyer on a Bicycle of 1966. Portrait of Isabel Rawsthorne standing in a street in Soho of 1967. Three Studies for Isabel Rawsthorne of 1968. Study for the Heads of George Dyer and Isabel Rawsthorne of 1967. In Two Studies for a Portrait of George Dyer of 1968, a painted nude image of Dyer is nailed to a wall or canvas behind a clothed, seated figure of Dyer. The nails seem at once to affix a flat image to a wall, to wound the figure, and to invoke the illusionistic nails introduced by Braque into a number of still lifes around 1910. An impetuously flung streak of white paint slides down Dyer's leg, as a similarly hurled handful of white paint had done in the 1966 portrait. Two Studies of George Dyer with a Dog of 1968. Three Studies for a Portrait of 1968. A pronounced ambiguity derives from the alternation of architecturally unrelated spaces in Sweeney Agonists of 1967. While the rooms shown at right and left are almost identical, they are separated by the jarringly dissimilar sleeping compartment of the central panel. In The Two Figures Lying on a Bed with Attendants of 1968, the space is essentially continuous, spanning the frames that divide the horizontal panorama into a trio of vertical paintings. Nestled together in parallel poses, the privacy of their room, guarded by Venetian blinds closed on the daylight beyond, the central subjects of this picture are striking in their stillness and closure. But they are not alone, instead flanked by pendant figures, one nude, one clothed. Lying Nude of 1969. The subject of Bacon's first identified portrait, done in 1951, this painter and grandson of Sigmund Freud appears in a full-length portrait triptych, 3 Studies for a Portrait of Lucian Freud of 1969. Freud sits on a cane-bottomed chair like those in Bacon's studio, but the artist has also incorporated the headboard recorded in photographs of Freud sitting on a bed, a headboard that echoes the thrones of Bacon's popes. In each panel, Freud's face is divided by a vertical element of the cube structure that surrounds him. A similar bisection had obscured the face of Portrait of George Dyer in a Mirror of 1968. But here the features of Freud are elucidated, since the skewed cube seems to multiply our vantage point prismatically. The concealed face of Dyer in the 1968 portrait is visible only in the massive television-like mirror, its reflection broken in half, as if the speed of Dyer's motion had eluded even the mirror's ability to record. Double Portrait of Lucian Freud and Frank Auerbach of 1964.